starting out on my first trip of the day of what could be probably 2, I think. I'm gonna try and keep it to 2 back and forth between the Poconos and New York City. I might do a 3rd trip just to the public storage, but that's a maybe. I have the bulk of what was still in my house on this trip. On the next trip, it's really just the final cleanup, cat-related stuff, maybe a few things still from the kitchen, the fridge, the cold stuff, and a mattress, which I plan on strapping to the roof of my car for the first time in my life. I will be doing that maneuver. I'll be that guy. Now, over the past few years, especially with all the canoe stuff I've been doing on the roof of my car, I've been getting really good at strap downs. Ratchet Straps. There's a number of names for them, but they're these wonderful devices that let you tighten a really strong band, these nylon bands, a lot like seatbelt bands, with the power of a vice. And there's a real knack to them, and I got used to that knack. I'm pretty good at it now. And I certainly have the confidence to do something like transport a mattress on the roof of my car, which I didn't have even when I moved out here. It was one of these fancy new style mattresses that came coiled up. It came like a spool, and you cut through the shrink wrap and you laid it out and it would inflate, and it's just as comfortable as any mattress. I read all the reviews and stuff to make sure I wasn't getting some kooky thing, but the price was comparable to a queen size mattress. It just ships more easily. It's orderable on Amazon, right? So some entrepreneurial manufacturer said, hey, I bet we could get a big part of the mattress business if we could just vacuum seal and spool up these things and ship them out, and they inflate when they get to where they're going. I thought that was pretty neat and has served me well. This is in fact the 2nd place that mattress has been, and to get it here, I folded it and put it into the car using these same ratchet straps. I would not do that again, and I want to keep as much of the car open for my kitties. I'm going to be transporting my kitties to the new location. This is a big day, and I do not want to fill the car that much. I want it to be as free and open for them to have some mobility on the trip as possible. I might put them into a Sherpa bag for the final transport in and out of the car so that they can't make a break for it and, control all variables, all that stuff. But we'll see. This is a major life change. I did not anticipate going back into New York City. Living expenses are very much higher. And now with the miracle of telecommuting being normalized, one of the big advantages in life is to be able to live somewhere other than New York City and to be able to draw a New York City salary. That is a special kind of magic. And you get a lot more power for the dollar. I rented a whole house for less money than what a tiny little studio, not even in Manhattan, we're talking one of the least desirable outer boroughs. Still ridiculously expensive. Anything in New York City. And I was hoping maybe the prices were coming down because of the pandemic and everything, but rental prices are still as high as ever. And I've moved for various reasons. It stuck in my head from the previous video when I figured out how many times I moved over what period of years, and it turns out I'm averaging a move every 2 years. 25 years, 12 moves. That's a lot of moving. And if you think through what goes on in your life when you do a move, the interruption to your life, the packing, the unpacking, the extra time that goes into all this stuff that normally becomes automatic. And I talk about muscle memory all the time. Familiar pathways, synaptic passages. that keep things going really without thinking, moving things into habit. And a lot of people live their lives by habit. I certainly don't, with moving as often as I do. That does not allow me to move all the mechanics of life into habit, except for the essentials, the close stuff. And for a few of those moves, that was really challenged. Things like having a bedside table was not possible. Things like having a file cabinet was not possible. A desk that you could sit down with table space, with like workspace. For many of those years, for 10 of those 25 years, I had to dramatically rethink what was normal and move a lot of my capabilities, a lot of that things that you rely on stuff around you for, back inside. These are reasons why things like the Mentats from Dune hold a lot of appeal to me, because they are human versions of computers. They organize things in their head, much like someone would organize things in their physical environment. As does Sherlock Holmes. He would often talk about how we only have so much room in our head to keep stuff, and we do have an attic, but you can only keep so much in the attic, and you got to organize it. And so when you rummage around up in there, you come up with what you need. So I've been doing stuff very much analogous to that in my head for just, keeping myself going, keeping functional. Now, on the professional front, clearly, I became obsessed with tools that I would not have to retrain on and be in competition with the youngins all over again every, 5 years or so, which is exactly what happens when you jump onto the mainstream fad and fashion-driven tools. These are about making money, ladies and gentlemen. These are about upgrade cycles, even if the products are free. All the business surrounding it is assuming you're going to be overhauling systems every 5 years or so, because there's a lot of business surrounding it. Even if the essential, open web stack is free, there's a lot of money to be made by pushing people on to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing. And it doesn't have to be that way, and it isn't that way everywhere. And you could see the resistance to it when Python was upgraded from 2 to 3, and the pushback against forced moves to Python 3. People deployed stuff on Python 2.6 or even earlier and figured it would just be able to stay that way forever. It's not broken, don't fix it. And that's very appealing. It's very appealing. The fact that the Python world tends to have that mentality has drawn me in. It has won me over. Because after the operating system repositioning, which, as any of you who follow me know, it means onto Linux for your main operating system for dev work. But that is really for all work. And people are like, oh, well, that seems odd because, all the things you use a computer for, it's Windows software or Mac software, desktop. Well, not once everything that you do with writing is moved over to Vim. Now you don't need the graphics. It doesn't have to be windowing. You get into the zone. You get into a more pure writing environment. So for people who are serious about writing, one of the best things to do is to give up all that Windows and Mac user interface stuff. Just learn an interface that will stay that way forever, and which lets you get into the flow and the zone more readily. And so for me, that takes care of large chunks of, what's necessary. And then a web browser is a web browser is a web browser. You do one, of course, the windowing graphic can hardly have, there are such things like the Links browser, but the web experience is silly if it's not graphical. So use any browser of your choice. They'll come up under any operating system and look functionally the same. Chrome or Firefox on Linux is the same as Chrome or Firefox on Windows or Mac. Hardly tell the difference. So you got your text editing environment, you got your browser. And then what else do you need? There's going to be some form of the Office software that you'll want every once in a while. And so for that, there's LibreOffice. If you really want your Excel clone. But I would say once you're on Python, you don't really need that. You can be in Python in a very web browser-like environment. So using Python through Jupyter Lab Desktop, I'd say is a good way to go. And then you start using pandas and you just become a super power user of all this Excel-like stuff. Sure, you can put it into Excel at the end of the process because people are going to want to interact with the data through Excel. But all the power user stuff of pulling your data, doing manipulations to your data, preparing it for final viewing, all can be done in Python side. You really don't need as much of the fancy Office software as one would think. You start finding alternatives in the free and open source world, particularly pandas under Python for everything Excel-like. And the world improves. You get better. Your skills become timeless. Excel can't keep disrupting you by changing interfaces, having limitations on rows it can handle. All the things that, the hunting and pecking for your formulas that get hidden and need to be updated different places. The lack of a good methodical approach to managing a complex spreadsheet, all that stuff just goes away and you have much better methodologies available to you. And then you can automate it because it's Python and it runs like a script. You could say, oh, that's a report I need every week, and you just put it over here and it's now running as a scheduled task, emailing it to you or dropping it somewhere on the network, updating the same file all the time or making a new file with a new name. It's all up to you. And these methodologies just never go obsolete. They're always what's needed. They're always one of the approaches to get done the work that needs to get done. Always relevant. Always short list of top choices. There's very little compromise about it. Probably the biggest compromise argument is that it's not JavaScript. It's not the full web stack. It's not the current thing that is fashion and fad. You think these things are never going to go away? They do. They go away. Today's darling technology is tomorrow's I can't believe we all used that. Except for Unix and Unix-like operating systems, first and foremost. Those have a good 50 or 100-year run, longer than your life. How many technologies can you say that about? Everything after the operating system choice becomes a lot more controversial because nothing is as tested and vetted as Unix-like operating systems. Those are the king of the hill, dominant, obsolescence-resistant tool. Their APIs rarely change. when they do, it's as hotly contested as it is in the Python world. The move from init v, init, something like that. The one that takes bash script files, a series of individual bash script files to do each service start, service stop, and it's mostly for managing services. Things that are just running all the time in the background, long-running things on an operating system. That's a service, generally. Things can also be scheduled, so they're not so long-running, but then you need a scheduling service to manage the scheduling, so you're still in the service world. Long-running is key, and operating system responsibility for keeping it long-running is key, and for managing it. So the API for that has changed pretty dramatically under Linux. Now, I often say Unix, Linux, no different. The commands are the same. But this system level stuff, the stuff that manages Linux daemons, it does start to diverge. It starts to diverge pretty significantly. Now, I'm going to bet that this will all trickle back into Unix because that's where it was copied from. Honestly, it was copied from Apple, so it was copied from Unix. I forget exactly what it was called. It was something even more simple than systemd. I forget if it was filedh or serviced or something very similar. And I got to get that history down because it's one of those great recent evolutions of Linux. These things don't happen very often. So once Apple solved the problem for Unix on the Mac, the Linux world had envy of that and wanted to solve that problem on Linux. And they did, and it became systemd. And life became easier. It became embraced by every meaningful distro of Linux. Now, I often like to refer to Debian as the innovator here because I believe the init v, the init d system that came before systemd was Debian. It was the project sponsors. They don't own it. It's free and open source, but there are the people who own the repos. They actually kind of do own it. And that has changed. That has switched hands. The people who call the shots now is Red Hat. The original corporate Linux now is managing systemd. And over that alone, a lot of people object to it. But that's religion, that's dogma. Like the way I was talking about things coming from Canonical, not being official from, linux.org or whatever. Same issue. There is no super real official because everyone who spins their own versions of Linux picks and chooses whatever they want. It's not tightly regulated like Unix is. Like, if you want to call it Unix, it has to do the following things. It's part of the whole ivory tower, characteristic of Unix. Unix is tightly regulated. Linux is not so tightly regulated. People do what they want with Linux. There's no POSIX standards going, oh, you're not a real Linux. Like there is in the Unix world. If you're not POSIX compliant, they can say, yeah, you can't label that a compatible Unix. So some of the technologies you have to gamble on. You're gambling on. They've mainstreamed enough. It's not that big of a gamble. LXD that I've been talking about a lot, even though it's from Canonical, not that big of a gamble if you're not using Docker, because Docker is strange. Docker is strange to people who just are using a system like a system. I want to be able to install software, I want to be able to configure the machine, and I want that whole thing to be a container. I want to be able to package it it up, move it somewhere, reproduce that environment on another container. I'm not making an app for an app store. A lot of people are, though. A lot of people are like, I want to install an app. I'm doing it on my main system. Oh, and then someone else is like, here's an app for you to install. It's intended to install cleanly on your main system. That's what Docker is really good at. If you need a database just plugged in, or you need a web server just plugged in, and you don't want to think about most of the configuration issues, Docker's great. It's like that feeling on mobile where you're using an app store. I guess that's what everyone is emulating these days. Everyone wants the ease that Apple demonstrated with the iPhone can be the norm. Everything is sandboxed, everything is isolated from each other, everything has their own namespace. If one thing is going to communicate with another, it can't just do it. It doesn't have the privileges to do it. It's sandboxed, and it has to be through very formal APIs. But that's okay, because that follows a very Unix-like model of piping data, the standard out of one thing to the standard into another. That's why, all that send to stuff. You go into a mobile app and you say open with or send to. That's very much that piping concept, because it's forcing you to go through a formal way to have one app ask to give input to another or to get input from another. Formal APIs come with all this formality and namespace control and fine attention to permissions, and a kind of paranoia against things that are overstepping their bounds. Things cannot read and write from each other's, repo space or inside each other's folders, unless it's registered and said this is now accessible to the operating system, so now other apps can have access to it too. Apple really changed stuff with iOS. Expectations changed all over the place. Docker, as a container technology for Linux, was very compatible with those new expectations. But for people like me, who really wanted something more like virtual machines, it felt uncomfortable. Compositing and stuff, so much overhead for stuff that you really didn't want or need. Persistence became a challenge because things naturally were not persistent. And I've seen this before. I've dealt with it. My version of Linux, the version of Linux I released, it's a respin. It's a respin of TinyCore and QEMU with some install scripts so that it runs from your desktop, whether your desktop happens to be Mac or Windows or another Linux desktop. A double click and Linux runs right as a virtual machine on your desktop, using the QEMU emulator to pull off that magic. But TinyCore Linux is what you would call an involatile, a non-changing, a hardwired, cast-in-stone version of Linux. There's no upgrading it. You pull out the last one and you put in a new one. There's no installing new libraries or, config files that go to a hard drive. All this stuff gets layered on top. It gets layered on, it either goes to mapped in drives that are persistent but aren't part of the operating system, because any directory in Linux or Unix can be a mount point to some arbitrary other device. It can be a different physical device. It can be a different partition on the same drive. It could be a different folder on the same partition of the same drive. It's the ultimate shell game. It just doesn't matter. So you can use those tricks to take something which is normally involatile and make it feel like you can write files and have persistence. The home directory. With TinyCore Linux, even though the operating system itself is generally non-writable, people make their home directory writable. Otherwise, your data is lost every time you quit out. But it doesn't begin and end at the home directory. In fact, I mentioned the /etc or etc directory. That's where a lot of configuration goes. Now, that's traditionally considered part of the operating system and thus involatile, immutable, unchangeable on Tiny Core Linux. So how do they do it? Well, you actually do it somewhere else on a file system and not in memory like the way Tiny Core is. And that is saved as a kind of patch, a composite layer that has to be reapplied every time you instantiate a new session of Tiny Core Linux, every time you do a startup. Because for it to know your config files, your persistent config files have to be loaded in and superimposed on top of the otherwise static and unchanging etc directory. I dealt with that. I dealt with that for Levinix with Tiny Core Linux. And I hate it. I hate the concept of compositing and patches when you can just make something persistent. Now, for Tiny Core Linux, it's completely excusable because of its experience it's providing as a kooky minimal Linux for tire kicking. You can use it for real stuff, but it gives you insights into Linux that you rarely get from other versions. It works more like an embedded Linux than it does a full desktop one. So, a lot of people are drawn to container technology because they don't have the problems of virtual machines. Virtual machines, as much of a panacea as they appear to be at first glance, and maybe at first try even, they are not. They are far from a cure-all to all your portable operating system woes. They just create more headache and grief, mostly from the large amounts of resources they consume and the low amounts of reliability and 24/7 always there. Because they consume a lot of resources, people tend to want to stop them or not have too many of them running. You certainly don't want to run it all the time and degrade your system performance because you need another copy of the whole kernel, you need another copy of the whole operating system, and a lot of this stuff is loaded in memory. So it's like you have, half the computer power. Now, with multitasking and everything, it does try to mitigate it, but you can tell. And then you're doing something critical on the virtual machine itself, and it pops like a soap bubble, and gone is your whole system, and all the data that was there too. That's why I was so keen on the ZFS, the Zettabyte file system from Sun's Open Solaris. And I really didn't have good luck getting it set up. I'm running LXD now, and I'm using the default operating system that they've included. It looks like on the newer versions, they don't try and compel you over to ZFS. No longer. All the original tutorials on the net on how to get onto ZFS, ZFS, encouraged you to go how to get onto LXD, Linux containers, encouraged you to go the LFS, Linux, alphabet soup, I'm losing it, ladies and gentlemen. To do Linux containers, they wanted you on the old Solaris, the old Sun Solaris file system, because it was really robust. It was good for containers and virtualization in general. However, things have changed, and it doesn't look like it's trying to compel you down that route anymore. So I just choose the defaults, and I stay on the defaults. Windows defaults are just Ubuntu 18.04, Bionic Beaver. Those defaults work less well when you're on Ubuntu 20.04, Focal Fossa, which is what gets installed by default on the Windows subsystem for Linux. So, the world changes very soon, ladies and gentlemen. The world changes soon when moving becomes easy on Linux. Microsoft, I don't think, is too keen on you getting comfortable on Linux as your primary work environment. They're seeing to that with VS Code. VS Code, which, while it will run on other operating systems than Windows, it will always run best on Windows. And if you don't think vendors play that little trick, you just don't know. Look at the games that Microsoft has played with the Mac version of Office over the years, the Mac version of Excel over the years, and that Adobe has played with the Mac and Windows versions of Photoshop. Subtle preferences are expressed by vendors by platform implementation support. Now, it being mostly a web-based thing, Electron, web components, it should actually be much more equal across platforms than Excel and Photoshop used to be, because those needed to be re-implemented in C, and there's a lot of subtlety that they had to attend to. It basically had to be fully re-implemented between the Mac version and the Windows versions, because Macs enforced you to use Objective-C, and Objective-C isn't popular on Windows platforms, so, everyone was using C++. So features got out of sync between Windows and Mac versions of software, and it was very painful. Maybe that won't be the case with VS Code, but one way or another, Microsoft is going to keep you from getting comfortable with the timeless tools of Unix and Linux, particularly for editing files. They don't want you on Vim, ladies and gentlemen. Microsoft very much does not want you on Vim. They don't want you to become a comfortable Vim person. How do I know that? Because of the amount of resources they're putting into VS Code. It's an alternative. They want you on VS Code. They don't particularly want you using Git through its command line user interface. They want you to rely on VS Code as your way of using Git. You won't even know another way of using Git. Honestly, I've seen people use VS Code to do code collaboration. Once you do it through that little drop-down menu from the lower left of VS Code, you're never touching the command line for Git. So that's Vim and Git, right? That's half of the toolbox I recommend taking up. Linux, Python, Vim, and Git. So Linux you'll be taking up one way or another, like it or not, sooner or later. It won't take long. There's no reason for PowerShell and the DOS prompt to continue to exist. Unix, like operating systems, won. Productive people use Unix-like operating systems. most of the world is not productive because they rely on that hunt and peck mouse interface. There are exceptions, there's outliers. Those people are like Photoshop gurus that do that stuff every day, or Blender people. I see Blender people working like that. And Blender is in the free and open source world, so it's one of the rare examples. If you want to see a purple unicorn, go look at Blender. When I say purple unicorn, it's like 2 levels of shouldn't be able to exist. I guess purple cow was the expression for a cow. I never saw a purple cow. I never hope to see one. But if you were to ask me so, I'd rather see than be one. And so a unicorn in human resources and hiring employees, a unicorn has come to be known as that impossible employee, the employee who has just all the right check marks and is also the genuine deal sufficiently in order to satisfy everyone, make everyone happy. So a purple unicorn is that to another degree. So anyway, I'm gonna wrap up here. I think this is a good closing point for the video. If I put a fine point on it, let's see. Home. It always gets back to home, doesn't it? Moving. Familiarity and comfort levels. What you bring with you, what's part of you versus what's some sort of external dependency that you have. Minimize these external dependencies, and when there are external dependencies, make sure they're of a nature that kind of sort of get internalized and will always be there of the free and open source world. So it's tough to accomplish, and I've had to do it. I've become very keen on it because of necessity. I move so much, I physically move so much that I need it occurring in my mind. If it's not occurring in my mind, the parts moving all around me willy-nilly and sometimes being taken away entirely would have lessened my ability to an unacceptable level. Clearly, they lessen your ability. Think how hyper effective you could be if things around you didn't change. You didn't have to move, every X amount of years. And you also got better at things in your head of the way that you would when you know you're going to have to be on the road, when you know you're going to have to be a road warrior. So the power of static plus the power of dynamic, but power of dynamic comes from the static parts being internalized. Dynamic is never fully dynamic. You need static parts for optimization, high performance, and such. So there, I put the fine point on it. Become a Dune Mentat. Follow me.